Okay, thank you very much. Hello everybody. Presentation's going to be in English. I shall try and keep it in English, but there may be a few other words from other languages that we will use. It's a pleasure to be here again for the 5th time. Thank you very much to Irina and Margarita for inviting me. I hope this presentation will be useful for you. You have the title there. Can I just ask you, is anybody planning to go abroad this summer to another country? Yeah, okay. Are you planning to go on holiday to another country this summer? Anybody? No? You'd like to. Are you planning to receive a visitor from another country to Spain this summer? Yeah, okay. And do you have any friends who you're in touch with by email or on chat or on the web? Yeah? Okay, so there may be something, I hope there's something in this presentation for you if you're in that category, and I hope some of the things we're going to explore today will be useful to you. I would like to try and involve you as much as possible in the presentation, so I'm going to be asking you some questions. Please do feel free to interrupt or to ask me questions. We're going to keep it fairly informal. Okay, so the first question for you, I'm going to give you half a minute for this. Can you just ask the person next to you this question? What communication problems do you think you would experience if you're visiting a foreign country? Can you just talk to the person next to you about that? Okay, any ideas? Anybody got anything they'd like to suggest? What communication problems might you face?
The first is language. Wait.
Yes.
Wait. The first is language.
Yep, good. Okay, so understanding the language, yes. Anything else? Yeah, good.
Is the most important problem.
Yes, okay. So understanding the language, yeah, okay. Let me just give you some ideas, and there are obviously lots of aspects which would be relevant. First thing, obviously, when you get to a new country, somewhere you're unfamiliar, is orientation, finding the way to go. If you're less proficient with the language, that can be a challenge. I mean, obviously, if you come to visit us in Leeds and you speak English, you know English, you can understand these signs. But imagine if you're in the middle of Beijing and everything is in Chinese. That's a skill in itself, isn't it? Understanding where to go, understanding the customs of the country, etc. All of that we can talk about is orientation. So that's important. The language, as we mentioned, is important. This is a picture of a restaurant in Seoul in South Korea. And what I think it illustrates is two things. One thing is to be understanding of the language. The written language in this case is different. The Korean script which you have at the top is something you may be unfamiliar with. And certainly when I'm there, I have to start thinking, well, I can't rely on the fact that there will be English. I don't read Korean, so I have to have strategies to be able to understand things because I can't read the top. So then I look at the bottom and I see that this is a translation into English of presumably what the top is saying. But notice what it says. Charcoal grilled large tripe entrails. Do you know what that is? Now, in Spanish, you might say tripas a la parrilla, for example. Okay? Now, for you, you might think, I go to a restaurant, I might eat that. Would you eat that? No? Would you eat some sort of meat à la parrilla? Yes, possibly. However, a British audience, if I said to them tripe intestines, grilled intestines, tripe, no, nobody's going to go there. You wouldn't take your coach load to that restaurant. So it's understanding part of the culture and what is appropriate is part of that. And then also what can be translated. In this case, certainly for a British audience, it seems a bit strange. Okay? So there's a lot we can say about language. Then also culture, understanding culture is very important. Again, this was a meal I was invited to in a typical Korean restaurant last year. You sit at a low table and you have lots of different plates and you share them between each other, and you need to know, well, is it my turn to take something? You're eating with chopsticks. There's a particular etiquette of how to use chopsticks. Are you familiar with using chopsticks? Some people saying yes, other people saying no. Does anybody know what you mustn't do with chopsticks? What's impolite to do with chopsticks?
I don't have any idea, but I can imagine that pointing to others.
That's right, yeah. You do not point with them, and you also mustn't do stabbing. I can't get it off the plate. You know, there are some types of food which are very difficult to lift, you know, and, you know, like if you've got a ball of rice, you don't stab your chopsticks in. That's very, very rude to do that. So it's understanding all those sort of things are important. So we should be, I point it the right way. So what I want to do today in the presentation is to look at this relationship between language and culture. And we'll try and explore it with some activities so that communication is not just about the words we use, it's how they're used and in what context. That's important. I want to then move on and look at some communication problems, and then to give you some strategies that you can use if you face those sort of problems, or to help you avoid communication problems as a result. So that's a sort of overview of the presentation. And this particular picture is just an indication of, you know, going back to the idea of orientation. This was taken in central Tokyo. You know, you appear there, everything, you can't read half of them, of the signs, but there are a few things you can recognize. You can see that McDonald's signs, you can see a bit of English and think, great, I can manage. But you're not always going to have that, so you need to have strategies to help you in situations where you don't have that support from the language. I did actually find a Spanish restaurant very close to there, so I was all right. Okay. Okay, another activity, short activity for you. With the person next to you for 30 seconds. How many alternative ways to the word hello do you know in English? Do you know any alternatives to saying to someone, hello? Yeah, just if you brainstorm with the person next to you, or people next to you. Do you want to move? Okay, any suggestions?
Hi, but is very formal, I think.
Mm-hmm.
How do you do?
Right. Mm-hmm. Okay. Anything else?
Good morning.
Yeah.
Morning.
Okay, so I'm going to show you some regional variations. Some of these you may know. If you're in Australia, you'll hear people say good day, for example. Whereas if you're in the UK, you might say hiya, or in the region I work at, in Yorkshire, you might even hear someone say eop, which is a very regional, it's dialect, it's local dialect. If you're in the US, they might say howdy. And then you've got slang like "what's up," yeah, for example, which is similar to this technological thing on the iPhone that you have now. So as you can see, there are many alternatives. I had an American flatmate when I lived here in Madrid, and I used to walk into the room and he used to go, "What's up?" Oh, no, nothing's up. Everything's fine. I didn't get it because I wasn't familiar at the time with that way of saying hello. So, you know, it's getting used to that sort of language. But there are all sorts of particular variations, and it will vary from person to person, but from particular regions they're important. So, for example, if you're in the small town of Golden in Colorado, you'll see this sign welcoming you to the main street. Howdy folks, and this just gives you an idea of, in this way, that the language is contextualized to that particular place and is very appropriate for them. However, would you see the similar sort of sign if you were in the middle of New York? Probably not. It's got a slightly different meaning. It's feeling of much more inclusive and welcoming. And the other thing to be aware of is those other ways of saying hello are not interchangeable. So if you came to Yorkshire, you wouldn't see a sign saying "Hey up, folks," because we don't use the language in that way. So it's important to be aware of regional differences, which you have in Spanish. If you go from one region of Spain to another, apart from the different languages, the way Spanish is used varies from region to region. It's no different. So just moving on. So language. Strevens writes that language is but one element of the complex, seamless fabric of the total culture of a society. So remember that culture is in addition to language, is about values, is about knowledge, is about material things. So for example, knowledge, not all societies know the same things. If you go to an indigenous tribe in the middle of the Amazon jungle and show them your iPhone, they won't know what you're talking about. And similarly, you won't know how to cook some food in a traditional way because we don't have the same knowledge. Knowledge is passed on through generations, etc. And there's a very important link then between language and culture. So the value of, in this case, yielding or giving up your seat to an elderly or an infirm person, is that a shared value? Is that something every society has? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I mean, obviously, here in Spain, you will have similar information notices. This is on the Tokyo Metro. But again, that just gives you one visual example of how language and culture is related. Point it the right way. Okay, so I have an activity now for you to see whether we share the same understanding of culture. I'd like you to have a look at this information board from a park in Tokyo, and I'd like you to tell me what you're not allowed to do in the park. Can you work it out from that information? Just have a look at it for a minute. Does anybody read Japanese? Okay, we're okay. If I'm making this presentation to a Japanese audience, or if anybody watching online is a Japanese speaker, you may find an advantage because you'll be able to read the script.
I have a question before starting. These are 6 things that can...
There are 6 things that you're not allowed to do in that park. Right, okay, that's good. So you can't play football. Yeah, any other ideas? Yeah, okay, no lighting fires.
Not playing baseball or
Yeah.
any other sport.
Right, okay, so no football, no baseball, no lighting fires. Anything else? Yeah, no sleeping, yeah.
Camping.
Or camping, no camping, yeah, fine. One more thing.
Not picking leaves or...
Right, yes, okay. No picking leaves.
Climbing trees.
Or climbing tree, yeah. Okay, so your thoughts are very similar to mine. Now, I'll tell you my thoughts, which are on the next slide. And I'm being a bit, as we would say, facetious or sarcastic, but by looking at those pictures, the first one was the top left of the little girl, okay? So I put, and what she's carrying, it's something with eyes. So I was facetious and I said, do not behead your animals and put them in the bin as if you would. But unfortunately, that is not what the park sign says. I've misunderstood it. It says, please take your trash away with you. Well, what's she carrying, an animal or a toy? I don't understand that. Okay, so let's look at the previous picture, the middle one. Okay, so the one on the top in the middle. I thought that was do not graffiti on the buildings or they will cry, because there are tears, poor buildings. But that's not what the park sign said. It said, let's keep the park facilities in good condition. The third one, which we all thought was making fires, please don't play with fire or fireworks. The next one with the tree, which was crying, don't cut the trees or they'll cry. Please be sure not to harm the plants' parks. The people who looked like they were sleeping, no camping. Please be quiet in the park. And do you remember the final picture of the baseball players? This one is surprising. I thought that meant no ball games, but it meant please be quiet at the park at night, which disturbs others. So you can play sport, but you mustn't make any noise. And I think that that is a good example of misunderstanding, because we don't understand the symbols, because they're cultural. Now, maybe to a person in Tokyo, they're perfectly obvious. But to you and me, by looking at it from outside, we've got a completely different. So we'll be playing baseball and we'll be camping and doing, you know, all sorts of things, and that's wrong. And there's no language there. It's purely visual, isn't it? So I think that's an example of, another example of language and culture. I'm going fairly quickly because we want to cover quite a bit of ground. So in that first part, just some examples of the relationship with language and culture and some things to be aware of. In this second section, what I want to do is to look at some communication problems and then to help you, give you some ideas of some communication strategies you can use to overcome the problems. So I'm going to give you an example of a problem which arose in a conversation exchange. I'd like you to have a read of the conversation again with the person next to you. You might like to take it in turns to read it or just read it silently. But these are the questions I'd like you to consider while you're reading the conversation. Why was the possible communication problem caused? What did the first speaker do to correct the problem? And what did the second speaker do to try to improve his or her understanding? Okay, so what caused the communication problem and how did they overcome it? So this is the exchange, if you'd just like to have a read of that. Okay, can anybody tell me what you think the communication problem, what was the reason for the possible problem of communication in this example?
second doesn't know what's the bottom line,
Good. Yes.
and the other one doesn't want to explain it. It keeps talking.
Mm-hmm.
The other doesn't.
Okay, so the expression bottom line is given by the first speaker. He asks, what is the bottom line? And the second speaker doesn't know what that is. So he says, bottom line? Yes. Yeah, he's unsure, isn't he? So what does the first speaker do to try to correct that misunderstanding? Any ideas?
Rephrases.
That's right.
And says the same expressions with other words.
That's right. So using the strategy of circumlocution. So using other words to express the same idea. So he says, so what it means, bottom line means the least you can do something for, or the least you can sell or make something for. The least price in this case. Okay? And what does the second speaker do to try and understand that?
I understand that he asks for clarification.
That's right. So that's right. He asks for clarification. He tries to understand meaning from context. So in this case, if you are faced with a situation where you have said something and the person you're talking to doesn't know what you're saying, you can try to express the same idea using other words, which is the strategy of circumlocution. And then you as a listener, if you're facing that problem, you can ask for clarification. You can try and understand what the person is saying from the situation, in this case, this particular dialogue. So that's an example of a typical communication problem. Okay, let's just look at one other. So do the same for this conversation. So what is the possible communication problem caused by, and what does the speaker do to try and correct the problem? Okay, any suggestions for what is the problem cause? In this example?
One is trying to use a popular expression, but the other one doesn't understand.
Good. And the expression is?
Too many chips and not nothing.
Good. Yeah, that's correct. So again, idiomatic use of language can cause huge problems in communication because it's not necessarily mutually understood, is it? In this case, the second speaker uses the expression too many chiefs, and the first speaker is not sure what that means, and therefore there's an exchange there. But through using clarification and also a bit of approximation, using a synonym, a similar word, bosses and chiefs are similar words, aren't they? The problem is solved, or at least is partially resolved. So again, another example of there, by using strategies, you can help to reduce the effects of possible communication. So, moving on, I'm going to ask you this question. Have you ever spoken to a foreign person speaking to you in Spanish, for example, and they've said to you, yo hablo español un poquito. And you've gone, yeah, bien. But then you've actually seen, maybe you've got a student, you know, a colleague here on your course, and they're from another country, and they say, I don't speak very much Spanish, but then you've seen them sitting in a lecture writing a perfect Spanish. Have you had that expression? Yeah? Do you know why that is? That they're very good at writing the language and maybe understanding, but not very good at speaking. Any ideas? Okay, this is partly a rhetorical question. In this case, that particular person has a level of grammatical competence, so the knowledge of what is grammatically correct in the language. And this is how we traditionally tend to learn a language, isn't it? We focus on actually how language is put together, but we have less opportunities to use it productively. However, you may have met foreign people who have spoken to you in Spanish, but they've sounded very rude. Have you had examples of that? Or any other language?
Well, it has happened to us in English.
Okay.
With our students.
Right, okay.
They use English as if it was Spanish, and they sound a bit rude.
Okay.
In English.
Good. Okay. So here it's a question of understanding this context of sociolinguistic competence, which is understanding what is socially acceptable in a language. And what may be socially acceptable in Spanish may not be the same in English and vice versa. You'll notice that British people particularly tend to say thank you a lot, and maybe please and thank you. And I remember when I first came to live in Spain, I used to use por favor and gracias y gracias y gracias. And people say, you don't need to say gracias so much. You need to say once or twice. Because we're used to doing that. That's our culture. Like in France, you say bonjour, au revoir. Bonjour, au revoir. It's part of the culture of the language, you know, and that varies. It's part of sociolinguistic competence. And have you ever tried to explain to somebody in English something and you just have had to give up the conversation because you didn't know what to say? Or somebody's spoken to you in Spanish, trying to tell you, you know, a story, and then they've just had to give up because they didn't know the words. Has that happened to you? Yeah? People nodding? Yeah? In this case, this is the idea of strategic competence, whereby the knowledge of how to use communication strategies to communicate intended meaning, which is what we're looking at today. So this is really important. In addition to knowing about the grammar, how the language works, what is appropriate in the language, it's very important to know how to communicate meaning, especially when faced with problems. And we're going to explore this third aspect a bit longer. Now, obviously, if you read the literature, which I won't talk about today, there's quite a lot of discussion about can you teach people or can we learn strategies, communication strategies. I would argue that yes, you can, but obviously with more proficiency and more practice, they become more automatic. So let's move on. This is just a brief definition of what a communication strategy is, and in this particular definition, notice the last part of it, that a communication strategy is used to deal with problems which may arise in the transmission of information. So it's during the communication exchange. It's not just about presenting and understanding. You're actually in the middle of a conversation, you face a problem, but then you've got something what's sometimes called compensation to compensate for any problems. So, I'm going to give you an activity now. Is anybody good at decorating, painting rooms? Do you do your own sort of stuff? Do you go to Leroy Merlin? No? Haven't got the loyalty card from Leroy Merlin? No? Oh. Okay. But you know what I'm talking about. Repainting the room. Okay? Do you know the words in English for doing that? If I sent you off to a shop in the US, Walmart, for example, in the US or in the UK, Would you be able to buy the products to repaint your bedroom? No? Well, I've given you the words in Spanish. Can you do it in English? Do you know the difference between pintura al agua and pintura brillante? No? Okay. So imagine that is what you've got to do. Okay? Anybody feel confident about doing it? Anybody would struggle, would have problems? Yeah? Yeah? Some people? So what we're going to think about is this is your situation, and what we're going to try to do is think about how you're going to communicate this. You're in the shop. What strategies can you use to get your products? But I'm going to help you. So I'm going to tell you what you're going to buy first, if it will work. So you're going to be asking for pintura al agua. That's correct, is it? Yeah. Okay. We call it emulsion paint. Okay. So I'd like a pot of emulsion paint. Pintura brillante is gloss paint. And where do you paint gloss paint? Would you paint the walls with gloss paint? No, no. That's right. So you'd paint that desk, or you'd paint the windowsills, that sort of thing, wouldn't you? How about un rodillo? That's a roller. Yeah? What would you use a roller to paint, for example, these chairs? What would you use the roller for? The walls, that's right. And why would you use a roller? That's right, it'll paint a lot, won't it? Yeah. Okay. And then you might want to clean your brushes when you've used your pintura brillante, the gloss paint. Because it's not dissoluble, you will need some aguaras, or you might use dissolvente. So then you would ask for white spirit or turpentine. But be careful. If you think, I don't know the word in English, be careful with white spirit if you're translating it from Spanish, because it could come up for espiritu blanco, which would sound very strange in English or in Spanish, wouldn't it? You know, so you can have great fun with this. So anyway, imagine you're in the DIY, the ironmongers, whatever you want to call it, and you're trying to buy these products, and you've got to get them, okay? So let's think of some strategies, okay? Let's take the roller, the paint roller. What strategy could you use? You don't know the word. What could you do?
Mimic.
That's right. Good. Yeah, you've seen my presentation before, haven't you? Okay, wait a minute. Before we come on to that, what might happen, though, is that you might just give up. You might just walk out of the shop and you'll go home and your family will say to you, look, I sent you to the shop with all this money and you came back empty-handed. You'll feel very disappointed. So I hope after this presentation today, you can all go to a shop in an English-speaking country or another country, it doesn't have English-speaking, and you can buy these products. What might happen, though, is you might give up, which would be message abandonment, or you might change the subject. So imagine this was a conversation about redecorating, which is not very exciting. You might say, well, yeah, but, oh, have you seen those beautiful roses outside? You know, they're much more interesting, and you move the topic that way, which is what we tend to do if we're good communicators, okay? But strategies you might use is, yes, you might mime. So you might say, well, I want this thing, and you might sort of say, you know, oh, yes, it's over here. Here you are, for example. So you might mime. What other strategies could you use to get your roller or your emulsion paint?
Try to explain for what the use of the product.
Yes, good. Okay, that's fine. So, yes, so you could say, and we'll come on to that exact one. I don't remember the order it comes, but it will come. You could ask for assistance. So what is this? You might come over and say, how do you call this? What's the word for this? You might get some assistance from the people. This was a group of Japanese students who asked me some questions when I was in Kyoto on one visit, and they had a pre-prepared list of questions. And they came and they asked me in my survey. I wasn't sure whether they understood my answers, but it was a good attempt at asking for clarification, asking for assistance. You could use the strategy of approximation. So if you know a similar word to what you want, then you could use that. But be careful, because, for example, if you were trying to describe what these gentlemen are doing, this was a shop making traditional sweets in Japan, in Nara, which is the old historical city in the center. Now, I would really struggle to tell you what they're doing in English because I don't know the words. I don't know what they were making. They were making a bean curd type sweet. So sometimes this works, but you may have to use circumlocution, which is explaining the idea. But approximation is using a similar word. Any other things you could use? Any other strategies? Okay, let's see what they say. You could make up a new word. So you might say, I don't know, a roll painter instead of a roller, for example, and that might help you. These are some examples from some of our students, of my students, who have made up some words in English in their essays. Notice the bottom one. Tesco cutting down rainforests will lead to the extension, rather than extinction, of some species of wildlife, such as the orangutan, which should be orangutan. So it can be quite amusing. But sometimes it can help get the meaning across in a conversation. And then, as we saw earlier, using other words to describe the context. So I'm trying to paint a wall. I want a machine or an implement to put the paint on the wall type thing would get you to roller, for example. You might borrow from Spanish, yeah? But be careful. There are many false friends, aren't there? Es muy sensible, when you mean, in English that would mean very sensible. You don't mean sensible, do you? You would mean sensitive, which has a completely different meaning. And there are a whole range of that. If you say, you might say to your English friend, I'm an excellent conductor, and they say, really, of the London Philharmonic? You're very good, huh? Excellent, really good. When you mean, you're a very good driver. So you have to be careful with these words. Or you might say, you know, you might use a Spanish word. I never liked him because he was so pijo. Pijo? What's pijo? We don't have pijos, you know. And how can you translate that? You're using a Spanish expression which doesn't exist in the other language. So you have to be careful. In this case, pijo could mean snooty, posh, spoilt. Those are the sort of approximations for that term. Okay. And sometimes accuracy in writing can cause communication problems. So again, these are from student essays. There's a high proportion of imported dairy food. Dairy, what's the error there? A diary is something you write down your appointments in on Monday, Tuesday. In this case, it should be dairy food. Dairy meaning milk products. Okay. Again, the use of the word hungry. Globally, 1 in 6 people sleeps hungry every night. It's been written down phonetically. Hungry and hungry. It's nearly lunchtime, so I better finish my presentation. Yeah? If 1 in 6 people sleeps in Hungary every night, I hope it's a big country. Again, you can see that on the internet if you watch it again. Okay, so what we've had a look there in that section of the talk is briefly at some communication problems, how they might arise, and some strategies, hopefully, that you'll be able to take away and use to improve your presentations and your communications. What I want to have a look at in the final section is a bit about the elements of communication. So what is involved in when we communicate, and go back to this idea of the relationship between language and culture. So if we imagine a pie chart, and I've drawn here for you a notional pie chart, and we have 3 elements in the pie chart. So we have communication, which is not just about grammar, vocabulary and phonology, the sounds of the language, but it's also based on linguistic, so language features, paralinguistic features, and non-linguistic features. Now, obviously, that is not an exact pie chart. In some communications, the non-linguistic features will be more than the linguistic, so that can change from exchange to exchange. That's just to give us a starting point. So have a look at this information sign, which I came across on a path up a mountain near to Kyoto in Japan. Notice what it says, an example of linguistic communication. So beautifully, Mount Daimonji, clean away your dog's stools. Do you understand it? What are they asking you to do? So who is it addressed to? Owners of dogs. And what must they do? Yes, so they're asking you to clean up after your dog if your dog makes a mess. Now, notice the use of language here. Quite interesting use of language. A stool, in Spanish, you would talk about heces, wouldn't you? A technical term. If you went to see the doctor, would they ask you about your heces? Maybe they would. But you wouldn't be talking with your family or friends with heces. Feces might be, in English, a more technical term. So quite a useful, you know, the doctors always say, I'd like to take a stool sample. You say, oh, would you? So interesting use of language there, but it gets the message across. Okay, this is just an example. This was me giving a presentation to some students at a university in Japan. And obviously, when you are giving a presentation like I am today, it's not just about what I'm saying, it's the paralinguistic features. These are other features or phenomena which occur alongside spoken language. So in terms of pitch, in terms of rate, loudness, and fluency. So, you know, obviously, if I speak to you in a monotone, the same tone, and my voice doesn't change at all, that will affect your understanding of what I'm saying to some extent. So the rises of my falls of my voice will help to show you where I'm stopping and starting. And somebody who's giving a formal lecture, if they're a good lecturer, you'll know when they're coming to the end of a section because they'll either slow down or the voice will fall. All of that is paralinguistics, among other features. If you watch the news tonight, just focus on how the newsreaders introduce new topics. What do they do at the end of a topic and start with a new one? That's all paralinguistics, and there's a whole science. And then the news, the non-linguistic, this would be pure visual stuff where language isn't involved. There is a bit of language there, but I'm discounting that. What's that sign saying? Any ideas? Yes, okay. Yeah, I mean, essentially it's saying, if you fall in this river, the fish will eat you. So. Okay, putting all that together then, we have information science, and going back to this idea of culture, this was on the Taipei Metro, which is advising you about your cell phones, how to use them. And again, the value there is that, for a start, the society wants to advise people of how they should use cell phones. gives you some advice about how to use them on the underground, but I think that's quite a nice link between the linguistic and the non-linguistic, putting in together into one information sign. So that goes together. But again, going back to the work of Strevens, he argues that many communication problems are more often to be caused by cultural misunderstandings more than language, because we get fixated on language. And if you have a look at this sign, again, this is from Japan. Can anybody tell me what is that saying, or what is that advising, and where might you see it? Yes? Yeah.
Danger in the platform.
Right, okay. It's a sign on a platform at a railway station, and what is it advising you?
To wait for the supervisor if your shoe goes in.
Yeah.
Between the platform.
Yeah, you've nearly got it. You must advise the station supervisor or a guard or attendant if a little child loses their hat. Now, we're all struggling a bit. Do children here in Spain, do they wear hats to school? Not very often, do they? Now, Japanese small children, primary school, they all wear little hats, which are normally made from felt, felpa, little hats, all the same. And obviously, they've had millions of hats on the train tracks. So they have these signs at the station. And the first time I saw that, I had no idea what it was. And that just gives you an example about cultural values, and culture varies from place to place. You know, you and I from outside won't be familiar, but a Japanese person immediately would know that, what that meant. And again, I won't go into thing about that, but obviously body language is, if you see my talk I gave last year about doing business internationally, body language is really important, especially when you're in business meetings, because there's a writer, a researcher called Hall, who made a distinction about cultures. He divided them into low and high context cultures. In a high context culture, the aspects of culture are not necessarily so obvious. So, for example, when you walk into a room, the way you're dressed is really important. Now, we all do that automatically, but in many countries, if I walk in a suit and tie, you think, great. If I walk in without a tie, you think, great. There's not necessarily a problem. But in some cultures, if I'm trying to sell you something and I'm not wearing a tie, immediately you're signaling something, because there are other factors. It's not just about what you say, it's the way you say it. If you give a gift to someone, it's not just about the gift, it's how it's presented. All of those sort of things are important. So in terms of body language, this is so cultural. If you, in some countries, you can stand much more closer to somebody than others. Touching people, you know. The eye contact, I have to sometimes go to parts of the world where I'm not allowed to look at any female people. It's just a complete no-no, and it's very difficult for me if I'm trying to ask them about their studies in the UK, if I can't directly talk to them. You know, all those sort of things are very cultural. So body language is important. Okay, we're going to just conclude, because I think we're coming up to time. But what I've tried to do this afternoon is to give you an indication of some of the relationship between language and culture, and how that can affect, in some circumstances, problems of communication. We've also had a look at some of the strategies you can use. So if you want to go to the DIY shop, you want to repaint a bedroom or do something out of the ordinary, or talk to someone about a subject which you're less fluent about, you have some other ways of getting the message across. So I'll leave you with my contact details. That's our departmental website. So do please send me an email if you'd like to, if you have any questions. And those are some further references for further reading if you are interested in the subject and want to take it further. So I'd like to thank you very much for your attention and good luck. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So yes, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Rupert, connected with your presentation and with the presentations this morning,
Yes.
I'd like you to, because we didn't finish talking about the top blanket.
Yes.
One of the students this
Yes,
morning,
that's right. Yeah.
referring to the
Yeah.
piracy,
Yeah, that's
spoke
right.
about the top blanket. You were here, so and you were telling me that you wouldn't say that in England. And could you tell them?
Yeah.
Because it is connected with
yeah.
cultural specific.
That's right. As you know, certainly here in Spain, it's quite common, isn't it, that someone will put literally a blanket on the street or on the beach or wherever it is, and they will put the products for sale, and you come along and you say, I'll have that CD, and off you go. We don't tend to have that because, okay, you may go to a pop festival or a market, and there are, but it is less common. What we have as an alternative in Britain, certainly, a car boot sale. So what is very common, that is somebody driving their car to a field or to an area, and lots of other people. And it originally started with literally you open the back of your car and you said, I've got these 5 things in the back, would you like to buy them? And now it becomes very common at weekends for people to buy things at car boot sales, and people tend to have a table or something like that. So I think we would say, you know, something you bought as a car boot sale. We have the expression to buy something, you know, get something, it fell off the back of the lorry, which is suggesting it was stolen. But I can't think of, at the moment anyway, an exact, because we don't necessarily have exactly the same, you know, idea for that.
I was asked in class,
yeah.
Sometimes it happens to us, and this is not an excuse, that students ask questions and they are very cultural.
Well, that's right, and that's why it's...
And we know that we never listened to that expression.
No.
So that we don't really
But that's why it's very difficult in the other language to find an exact term, you know, to translate that. And I think that's why you need to use the strategy of circumlocution in that case to say this is, you know, when somebody sells products from a blanket which they put on the ground, you know, on the street, you know, and explain the concept to whoever you're talking to. Yeah.
Do you think that strategic competence can be learned or taught? You said yes, but from the very moment students start learning English or when they have arrived to a certain level, I mean, it goes parallel to the learning of, do you think it goes parallel with the learning of the language?
I think being a complete beginner in the language, it's much more difficult to use these strategies we've looked at today and other strategies. I think obviously the use of strategies expands as you become more fluent with the language, and certain strategies you definitely need if you want to use circumlocution, approximation, even word coinage. You need to have more knowledge of the language. So yeah, but I do think, I mean, there is some research in the literature to say you can't teach strategies or certainly communication strategies directly, and I disagree with that. I think you can teach them to some extent, but it's a question of practicing them. And it's like everything, it's awareness. You know, a lot of language learning is about understanding what is possible and then trying it out. So.
And I think Rupert is a very good example of this sort of strategies and the need of awareness, because even in our own language, in Spanish, when we talk to people from South America, sometimes communication is very difficult because, for example, they never say no, as we do say here, very straightforward. So that they will say, if you ask them directly something, they may say, yes, yes, I can. But you have to understand that it's not, maybe they don't, but they wouldn't say no.
Yeah.
So, and the communication becomes very difficult sometimes, and it is because we lack because our lack of awareness of the different culture. And
Yeah,
it creates
that's right.
a lot of misunderstanding.
Yeah, that's a good example, yeah.
I think.
Yeah. And in addition, I mean, all of us in our own languages, there are topics we're asked to talk about and we have absolutely no idea about them. I mean, nobody is proficient in every aspect of your own native language. There are topics which you would never dealt with. You know, if you suddenly have to talk about something medical or dental or something very specific, until you have experienced that area, you won't be able to discuss it properly, you know. So the strategies apply to your own, you know, language as well.
Finishing your talk, you said, thank you very much, you said this afternoon, so for you, it is the afternoon, so thank you
Yes,
very much.
that's right, the afternoon. Yes, that's right, yes, I know. Yes, well, I live on Spanish time, but yes, it is still afternoon, yes.
So if you don't have more questions,
Yes.
thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.